Orphaned pups followed the Omega everywhere, until the Alpha King followed and found out why. The wind whispered through the tall pines that bordered the kingdom's edge, carrying with it the scent of mist and wildflowers. Gray shadows stretched long, merging with the silver sheen of the rising moon. The pack stirred in its hidden valley, a quiet murmuring of life that thrived under the watchful gaze of the Alpha King. For he was a figure of awe, a presence that could silence the loudest of hearts with a mere glance. Legend spoke of his strength, of battles won and enemies crushed, but also of a lonely heart hidden beneath the iron crown he wore. The people of the kingdom respected him, feared him, and some even revered him as a force of nature itself. Yet tonight he was not in his castle. Tonight, curiosity had led him to the outskirts of the wild, drawn by a strange pattern that whispered of both mystery and sorrow. The Alpha King's eyes, sharp as moonlight on ice, caught sight of the strange procession first from afar. Small figures moved in silence, following a lone figure that seemed both ordinary and extraordinary at once. The Alpha King's heart, though hardened by years of command, flickered with interest. Desperate caught of desperation. The figure they followed was the Omega, a quiet soul of the pack. Unlike the Alpha, the Omega bore no crown, no authority, yet commanded a different kind of power, a quiet magnetism that drew those lost or weak to them. The orphaned pups trailed at their heels, little shadows with shining eyes that reflected the moonlight. Wherever the Omega went, they went too. Desperation, over the mossy rocks, into the hollowed groves of the forest, the pups never faltered. The king watched from the shadows, concealed by the dense trees. He noted the care with which the Omega moved. Every glance cast over their shoulder was gentle, almost reverent. A pup stumbled over a root, and the Omega paused, kneeling in the soft earth to lift it with tender hands. Another barked nervously at the sounds of the night, and the Omega whispered, words soft and melodic, and the pup's fear faded like smoke in the wind. A strange feeling settled over the king, a tug at the parts of him long thought dormant. He had seen bravery before, even kindness, but never such an effortless command of loyalty and love without fear. The Alpha had dominion over the pack through strength, through rules and fear. The Omega held dominion through something subtler, compassion, understanding, and a patience that the king had never cultivated.
He stepped closer, careful not to disturb the quiet procession.
The forest floor softened beneath his boots, moss and leaf muffling his approach.
He saw the Omega's face for the first time under the silver wash of moonlight, pale, sharp-featured, framed with hair dark as raven wings. Their eyes were wide, reflecting both sorrow and a quiet resilience. The king's chest tightened as he realized there was a story written in the lines of that face, a story of loss and endurance, of solitude and the burden of protecting those weaker than oneself. The pups followed faithfully, each seeming to sense the Omega's every emotion. When the Omega stopped, they stopped. When the Omega moved faster, they quickened their pace, paws barely making a sound on the soft earth. One pup, smaller than the rest, faltered and whimpered, but the Omega paused again, kneeling to gather it in their arms. The king noticed then that this pup had a scar on its hind leg, and the Omega's gentle touch seemed to soothe more than the pain of the flesh. It soothed the pain of abandonment, the fear of being alone.
He could not remember the last time he had felt such a stirring in his chest, nor could he explain the sudden ache that had begun at the sight of loyalty born not of fear, but of trust.
The Alpha King, who had ruled with unquestioned authority for decades, felt something unfamiliar, curiosity and longing entwined, urging him forward into danger. The Omega finally settled at the edge of a small clearing. Fireflies danced above a pond, their reflections mirrored in the water like fleeting stars. The pups circled around the Omega, tails wagging in contentment, eyes bright and trusting. The Omega sat on a fallen log, their gaze scanning the forest as though searching for something unseen. They hummed a soft melody, a sound carried on the night breeze, and the pups relaxed further, some curling against their legs, others resting their heads on each other. The king held his breath. How could one person command such devotion without commanding at all? Brr. How could one life seemingly ordinary hold such a force of loyalty and love? He did not notice the shadow moving closer to him until a twig snapped beneath his foot. Brr. Instantly, the Omega's head turned, eyes scanning the darkness with the instinct of a predator long accustomed to threat. The pups growled softly, warning the unseen intruder to stay back. Brr. The king froze, and then, slowly, stepped into the clearing, letting the moonlight reveal his presence. The Omega rose to their feet, a mixture of caution and defiance in their posture. Buried. The pups immediately gathered behind them, forming a living barrier. "You've been following me," the Omega said, voice steady but wary. Inspiration. The king inclined his head. "I noticed your companions," he said, his voice low, commanding, yet curious. Inspiration. "The orphaned pups. They follow you everywhere." Inspiration. "Ah, I had to see why." "And have you found your answer?" "Not yet," the king admitted. His gaze swept over the little creatures, resting again on the Omega. "But I will." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle splash of water in the pond and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The Omega studied him with careful eyes, measuring, weighing, and testing. "You are the Alpha King," the Omega said finally. A statement, not a question. Inspiration. "You do not follow, you command." "And yet," he replied, "I follow now." His eyes softened, the hardness of authority replaced by something more human, more uncertain. Inspiration. "Because I think there is more here than loyalty. There is something extraordinary." The Omega's lips twitched, almost a smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Extraordinary often comes with pain," they said, "and the pups have learned that." "I simply protect them." Inspiration. The king's chest tightened. "And what of you?" Inspiration. "Who protects the protector?" The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered. The Omega's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing a crack in their composed demeanor. Then it was gone, replaced by the calm, controlled presence that had drawn the pups so faithfully. "Now you see why they follow me," the Omega said, voice softer, almost resigned.
I am not extraordinary. I am...
Bert needed. The king studied them, the words resonating deeper than he expected. Inspiration. In that moment, he understood something vital. Power did not always belong to the strongest, nor did authority belong to the loudest. Sometimes power belonged to the one who could heal, who could care, who could stand alone and still carry the burdens of those weaker than themselves. A sudden rustle in the forest startled both King and Omega. The smallest pup yipped and bolted toward the trees, and instinctively, the Omega moved to catch it. The king acted without thinking, stepping forward and intercepting the pup, returning it safely to its protector. For the first time, the Omega's defenses wavered. Their eyes met the king's, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, understanding, and the faintest hint of connection. Neither spoke, for words could not capture the storm of emotion swirling in the moonlit clearing. Finally,
The king stepped back, giving space yet remaining in the circle of trust.
"I will watch over them if you allow it," he said. "And perhaps—" Brr. The Omega studied him again. The pups huddled closer in response to the sudden shift. Duration. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible nod, they accepted his presence. Not fully, not yet, but enough to allow him to remain. The night deepened, and the fireflies glimmered above the pond. Brr.
The Alpha King stayed, hidden in the shadows but close enough to see the Omega care for the orphaned pups. The king knew then that the path ahead would not be one of domination nor of conquest.
It would be a path of understanding, of patience, and perhaps of redemption for two souls who had endured far too much alone. Berets. As dawn approached, painting the horizon with streaks of rose and gold, the Omega gathered the pups and moved toward the forest's edge, their steps light and deliberate. The king followed at a careful distance, curious and compelled beyond reason. Something ancient and unspoken had begun between them. A tension of fate, of power, of hearts that had long been lonely now inching toward one another in the quietest of dances. And somewhere in the distance, hidden among the fog in the trees, the faintest whisper of an old curse stirred. The journey had begun, but its trials had only just taken shape. The king knew it would not be simple. The Omega knew they could not rely on strength alone. And the pups, innocent and pure, followed their chosen protector, unaware that their loyalty had awakened a storm that might change the pack forever. The Alpha King clenched his jaw, heart pounding with an unfamiliar rhythm. He would follow, no matter the danger. And perhaps in following, he would find the answer to the question he had not yet dared to ask. What does it mean to protect someone, and to be protected in return? The forest fell silent, but the tension remained, a living, breathing thing between the Omega and the Alpha King. The journey had begun, and the night would never be the same again. The forest thickened as dawn faded into morning, a dense canopy of twisted branches and silver leaves that filtered the sunlight into pale, trembling beams. The Alpha King followed at a careful distance, his boots quiet on the soft earth. The Omega moved through the forest with the ease of someone who belonged to its every shadow and whisper, the orphaned pups trotting alongside them in perfect synchrony. But King observed, noting the smallest gestures, how the Omega's hand would brush against a sapling to steady themselves, how their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, always vigilant, always protective. The pups followed every motion with unthinking loyalty, their trust absolute, and the king could feel a pull in his chest that he had not felt in decades. Curiosity was not enough. He needed to understand the bond, the reason these lost souls clung so fiercely to the Omega. It became clear after a short trek through the forest. The Omega's life was a mosaic of small, deliberate sacrifices. When the path narrowed to a rocky incline, they paused, lifting the smallest pups over obstacles with careful hands. When a branch threatened to scratch them, the Omega shielded the pups instinctively, bending their own body to absorb the danger. And when a distant howl echoed through the trees, a predator, perhaps, or another pack testing boundaries, the Omega's posture stiffened, a subtle command flowing outward, and the pups bristled in protection, ready to follow their leader wherever needed. The king could not help but admire the Omega. Strength came in many forms, he realized, and the kind the Omega possessed was often overlooked in a world that celebrated power through dominance. Here, authority came through love, through sacrifice, and through the quiet command of trust. And yet something else lingered beneath the surface. A sadness in the Omega's eyes, a weight no orphaned pup could lift. At a small clearing near a glistening stream, The Omega finally stopped. They knelt on the soft moss, gathering water in their cupped hands for the thirsty pups. One by one, each drank, trembling with exhaustion and hunger. The Omega's fingers lingered over their fur, brushing away dirt and tiny scars. The king watched silently, sensing that the true story of their life lay not in what they did, but in what they had endured. It was then that the king noticed the Omega's hesitation. Their gaze drifted beyond the forest toward the hills in the distance. A shadow flickered across their face. A memory, perhaps, or a pain too deep to voice. The king's curiosity pushed him forward. "You better wait," he said softly, stepping from the shadows. "I can see it." The Omega stiffened, eyes narrowing, but did not flee. "I bear what I must," they replied. Their voice was calm even, but the king sensed the edge of something raw beneath it. Grief, fear, resilience, all intermingled. "Must," the king repeated, stepping closer. "Or is it because no one else could bear it for you?" The Omega looked at him, really looked, and for a moment the forest held its breath. In that gaze, the king saw fragments of a story, a family lost, a past shadowed by tragedy, a curse that had left the Omega alone. And in the next heartbeat, the gaze hardened, replaced by the calm, unyielding presence that had drawn the pups to them. "You know nothing of it," the Omega said, voice quiet but firm. "And yet you follow, as though compelled by some invisible thread." "And because I want to understand?" There was a pause, then a subtle change in the Omega's posture. They did not retreat, though every instinct told them to guard, to hide. Instead, they allowed the king a closer presence. The pups, sensing the tension and the unspoken truce, huddled closer to the Omega's side. For hours they moved together, the king observing and the Omega silently guiding the pups. It was a rhythm, almost musical in its precision, the balance of protection, care, and survival. And as the forest deepened, so did the king's understanding of the Omega's life. Each small act of kindness, each sacrifice, was a thread in a larger tapestry, a tapestry woven from grief and endurance, from loss transformed into strength. As dusk approached, the Omega halted beside an ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Beneath its roots was a small hollow, worn smooth by years of use. The Omega lifted the pups gently into the hollow, arranging them like precious stones in a hidden nest. One pup, smaller and trembling, leaned into the Omega's chest, seeking warmth. The Omega closed their eyes for a heartbeat, their lips pressed to the pup's head in a silent vow of protection. The king watched, feeling a tension he could not name. The Omega's strength was a shield, yes, but also a prison. The king understood that the true challenge was not merely to protect the Omega, but to enter that prison without breaking it, to offer understanding without claiming dominion. Suddenly, one pup whimpered and the Omega's eyes flashed with concern. They leaned closer, inspecting the pup's small body. There, faintly, was the mark of the curse, a subtle pallor in the eyes, a weakness in the legs. The king's chest tightened. He had expected challenges, threats from rival packs or the wild forest, but never this. The curse, subtle and insidious, touching even the innocent. "I can help," the king said, stepping closer. "Do not bear this alone." The Omega's gaze lifted, meeting his. For a moment, fear and hesitation clashed with need and trust. "This is my burden," they said. "I must endure it for them, or they will suffer as I have. And if you falter, the king asked gently, who bears it then? The question hung in the air, and the Omega said nothing. Only the pups stirred, curling closer as if sensing the unspoken tension. Brat. The king reached out, resting a hand on the Omega's shoulder. A silent offering of strength, a promise of shared burden. The Omega did not flinch, but neither did they relax. Beret. Instead, they allowed the king's presence, an acknowledgement that perhaps, in time, trust could be extended to someone as powerful and steadfast as him. Night fell, the moon rising like a silver sentinel above the treetops. Inspiration. Stars glittered through the canopy, scattered like scattered memories of the past. The king and the Omega settled beside the pups, the quiet rhythm of the forest filling the spaces between words. Inspiration. You carry more than just their weight, the king said softly. I see the shadows you have walked through. I see your solitude. The Omega's eyes shimmered faintly in the moonlight. It is a path I have chosen, they replied. Inspiration. Loneliness is sometimes the only shield that keeps others safe.
And yet, the king said, voice low, even shields can break. Even the strongest can be wounded.
Inspiration. The Omega looked away, focusing on the pups now sleeping peacefully.
Beret. Perhaps, they whispered, but the shield is still needed, and I will endure.
A silence settled, but it was not empty. It was filled with unspoken acknowledgement, a bond forming slowly, imperceptibly.
Inspiration. The king understood that this was not just a test of strength, but of patience, of humility, and of willingness to see beyond appearances. Then a sudden rustle in the forest startled both king and Omega. The smallest pup leapt awake, ears pricked, growling softly. The Omega rose, eyes sharp, ready to defend, while the king stepped closer, his presence steady and reassuring. Together they faced the unknown, a unity forming between them, one forged not by power, but by understanding, protection, and the shared duty of care. Breath. In that moment, the king realized the truth. The Omega's strength was a reflection of their pain, and their power was rooted in the trust and devotion of those who had known loss. Inspiration. The pups were not merely followers. They were mirrors, small fragments of the Omega's own heart, lost yet resilient, seeking connection in a world that had taken much from them. The night deepened, the forest alive with unseen movements and whispered promises. The Alpha King and the Omega stood together, not as ruler and subject, but as two souls recognizing the weight each carried. The bond had begun, fragile but undeniable, a tether that neither time nor danger could easily sever. Inspiration. And somewhere beyond the veil of shadows and trees, the faint echo of the curse lingered, a reminder that their journey was far from over. The king knew he could not turn back. Bert. The Omega knew they could not face it alone, and the pups, innocent and trusting, would follow wherever the path led, through shadow, through trial, and toward a destiny only the moon and stars could witness. The forest held its breath, and the Alpha King felt the stirrings of a truth long denied. Power alone was meaningless without understanding. Loyalty alone was hollow without protection. And love, quiet, patient, enduring love, was the force that could bind even the most fractured hearts together. As the moonlight touched the leaves, glimmering like shards of silver, the king made a silent vow. He would follow the Omega, through darkness and curse, through shadow and trial, until he understood the depth of the heart he had stumbled upon. Inspiration. And perhaps, he thought, the Omega might one day allow him to walk beside them, not as a king, but as something more, an equal, a protector, and perhaps, in time, a companion of the soul. The night whispered on, and the forest, eternal and patient, seemed to lean closer, bearing witness to the quiet unfolding of a story that had only just begun. The forest grew darker as night fell again, the moon rising like a pale sentinel above twisted branches. Desperation. Shadows clung to every tree, twisting the familiar paths into something almost unrecognizable. The Alpha King followed the Omega and the orphaned pups, his senses sharpened. Every rustle, every distant howl, every flicker of movement set him on alert. The forest was alive. But this night carried a weight beyond mere wildlife. It was as if the trees themselves watched, holding their breath. The Omega moved with the same quiet grace as before, but tonight their steps were heavier, burdened by something the king could feel even from a distance. The pups followed, clustered close, their tiny forms pressed to the Omega as if sensing the unease. The king's heart clenched. He knew instinctively that the curse they had whispered about in the previous night was not idle rumor. It had a presence here, tangible, like a shadow moving just beyond the moonlight. Finally, the Omega stopped beside a clearing, where the moonlight spilled like silver liquid over a small pool. The water was still, reflecting not just the moon but the tangled branches overhead. The pups hesitated at the edge, growling softly, tails tucked. The Omega knelt, eyes scanning the pool, their fingers brushing the surface of the water as though testing for unseen currents. The king stepped closer, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and concern. He knew the Omega sensed the curse more strongly here, for the air itself seemed to pulse with it. "You feel it too," the king said softly, keeping his voice calm so as not to alarm the pups. The Omega's gaze lifted, meeting his. Their eyes were tired, shadowed, yet fierce. "It is stronger tonight," they admitted. The curse feeds on fear, on uncertainty, on loss, and it is drawn to those who have known too much of it already. The king nodded, instinctively understanding. "Then we face it together," he said. His voice carried authority, but also something deeper, a promise that went beyond command. The Omega's lips curved into a faint, almost reluctant smile. "Together," they repeated. "But it will not be easy. It will test not only the pups and me, but you as well." The king inclined his head, unwavering. "I am ready." The air grew colder, a wind rising that carried whispers, faint voices almost like the memories of those lost brushing against the edges of consciousness. The pups whimpered, huddling closer to the Omega, who wrapped a protective arm around them. Suddenly, a shadow shifted at the edge of the clearing. The king moved first, stepping forward with the speed and precision of a predator. The Omega did not hesitate, meeting him at the center of the pool's reflection, their presence a shield around the pups. Together they faced the source of the movement, a wisp of darkness that coalesced into a faint, twisted figure, fleeting but menacing. The Omega spoke softly, words carried with authority and recognition. "You do not belong here. You cannot touch them." The shadow hissed, an empty sound that echoed off the trees. "I touch only what is bound to me," it whispered. "The lost, the weak, the cursed." The king stepped beside the Omega, placing his hand over theirs. "Not tonight," he said firmly.
They are under my protection as much as yours, and you will not take them.
Half. The shadow recoiled, a ripple of dark mist passing over the water. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to tremble. The pups whimpered, their eyes wide, but the Omega and the king stood firm, bodies aligned, hearts tethered to each other in unspoken understanding. Hours passed like this, Stillness punctuated by distant rustles and faint, unsettling whispers. Inspiration. Slowly, the Omega revealed more of their past, drawn by the king's calm presence and the understanding in his eyes. My family! Inspiration. They were taken by this curse, the Omega said, voice low and steady, yet tinged with sorrow. It followed them, consumed them, left me alone. I swore I would carry what remained, the children, the lost, the weak, inspiration, until they had someone to guide them. The king listened, the ache in his chest deepening. Bert. He had faced enemies, wars, betrayals. But the Omega's quiet endurance stirred something within him. A recognition of courage that had nothing to do with battle or dominion. This was bravery that came from the heart, from compassion, from the willingness to bear pain for those who could not protect themselves. And yet, the king said softly, you carry this alone. Inspiration. You should not have to. The Omega's eyes flickered, revealing the vulnerability beneath their calm surface.
It is what I know, they whispered. It is what I was taught by loss.
Inspiration. To rely on no one but yourself is the only way to survive. Perhaps, the king said, but survival alone is not living, and neither should it be your burden entirely. Bert. For a long moment, neither spoke. The pups nestled in the Omega's lap, their breathing soft and steady, but tension lingered in the air like a held breath. Inspiration. Then a sudden motion caught their attention. The shadow had returned, moving closer to the edge of the clearing. The Omega rose, stance defensive, eyes scanning every movement. The king stepped forward beside them. You cannot harm them, he said, voice firm, unwavering. Not while I stand here, the shadow faltered, then shifted back into the forest, leaving only a cold wind behind. The king exhaled slowly, muscles relaxing slightly, but he did not remove his hand from the Omega's shoulder. The gesture was simple, protective, yet it carried a promise. Whatever came, they would face it together. The Omega met his gaze then, truly met it, and for the first time allowed the smallest flicker of trust to pass between them. I have never had someone follow me like this, they admitted quietly. Inspiration. Never someone who did not seek to command, only to understand. The king's lips curved faintly, almost a smile. Then perhaps we are learning together, he said. Inspiration. And perhaps trust is something we build, not demand. Inspiration. The Omega's eyes softened, and for a moment the forest seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the fragile connection forming. The pups, sensing the shift, relaxed further, curling closer to their protector, their small bodies a living symbol of loyalty and trust. Night deepened, shadows merging with the darkness of the forest. The king and Omega remained close, sharing glances and silent gestures, an unspoken dance of understanding. Inspiration. It was not love yet, not fully, but it was a connection, forged through shared protection, mutual respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of pain. Then, from the deeper forest, came a cry, sharp, urgent, a sound that made the pups rise in alarm. The Omega's body tensed, instincts taking over. Without hesitation, they moved toward the sound, the king at their side. The source was a small clearing hidden beneath the twisted branches of ancient trees. Inspiration. A single pup separated from the group lay trembling. The curse's influence had touched it, pale and weak, eyes glazed with fear. Inspiration. The Omega knelt, hands gentle as they lifted the pup, murmuring soothing words that carried strength and comfort. The king watched, admiration and concern battling within him. The Omega's strength was extraordinary, yes, but fragile in its solitude. And now, facing the tangible effect of the curse, he understood the stakes. It was not just a threat to the pups or the Omega, but a test of endurance, loyalty, and courage for all of them.
You cannot face this alone, he said, voice soft, almost a whisper. Let me help you. The Omega hesitated, the walls around them trembling.
Inspiration. Trust was difficult, learned slowly over years of loss and hardship. But something in the king's steady gaze, the calm, unwavering presence that had followed them into danger without demand, broke a fragment of that wall.
Inspiration.
Then, together, the Omega murmured. Inspiration. And in that moment, the bond shifted, strengthened, the weight of loneliness shared between them. Together they lifted the pup, returning it to the group. The curse's shadow lingered at the edge of the clearing, a constant reminder of danger, but the king and Omega stood side by side, their combined strength a barrier that nothing could easily penetrate. The night wore on, the forest alive with unseen movements and whispered promises. The Alpha King and the Omega remained close. The pups nestled safely between them. Inspiration. And as the first pale light of dawn touched the treetops, the king realized that this was more than protection. It was partnership, understanding, and the beginning of a trust that neither time nor shadow could undo. But even as the sun rose, painting the forest in gold and green, a faint whisper of the curse lingered in the distance, a reminder that the trials were far from over. The king and Omega had taken a step toward each other, toward understanding and shared burden, but the path ahead would demand even more courage, more endurance, and more heart than either had yet imagined. And somewhere, in the depth of the forest, the shadow waited, inspiration and watchful, as the bond between Alpha and Omega began to shine, fragile but unbreakable, guiding the pups toward a destiny that would test them all. In shadow, in moonlight, and in the quiet strength of the heart, the forest had grown silent, a heavy quiet that pressed against the senses. Even the wind seemed to pause as the Alpha King and the Omega moved deeper into the heart of the cursed woods. The air was thick with a subtle chill, and faint shadows twisted along the trunks of ancient trees, as if the forest itself whispered secrets it had long kept hidden. The pups clustered tightly around the Omega, eyes wide with uncertainty. They could sense the power of the curse, a dark force pressing against them, and they leaned instinctively into the protector who had always shielded them. The Omega's hands rested on their small backs, calm but tense, while the king moved beside them, alert and watchful. Inspiration. "This is where it grows strongest," the Omega whispered, their voice barely audible over the soft rustle of leaves. "Here the curse feeds not just on fear, but on doubt and sorrow. We must be careful." The king nodded. "Then we face it together. I will not leave your side." Inspiration. The Omega met his gaze, and in their eyes he saw gratitude but also fear. Not for himself, but for the pups, for the fragile bond that held them all together. Inspiration. He understood then that protection was more than strength. It was endurance, patience, and courage, both quiet and unyielding. They entered a glade where the shadows seemed to coil like living serpents among the roots and rocks. Inspiration. The ground was cold beneath their feet, and a faint glow emanated from the twisted trees, illuminating the space with an unnatural, almost ethereal light. The king could feel the weight of the curse pressing down, subtle yet suffocating. Suddenly, from the darkest corner of the glade, a shadow detached itself, darker than the night, shifting and pulsating like a living mist. It hovered just above the ground, and a voice echoed from its form, hollow and chilling. Inspiration. "You have come," it said, "drawn by loyalty, drawn by care, but you cannot save what is bound to the curse." The Omega stepped forward, chest lifted, hands extended protectively over the pups. "You are wrong," they said firmly. "Parade, we will not be broken. We are stronger than your shadows, stronger than fear." The king stood beside them, his presence steady and unwavering. They are not alone, he said, and neither are you. Breath.
We face this together! The shadow recoiled at their united stance, twisting in rage.
It lunged forward, a wave of cold darkness aimed at the group. The king acted immediately, placing himself between the Omega and the Force.
A surge of energy radiated from him, not from brute strength, but from the resolve and determination he had cultivated through years of leadership and loyalty. The Omega raised their hands, focusing on the pups, whispering words of courage and protection. The energy of care, of sacrifice, of love for those weaker than themselves, radiated outward like a shield. The pups huddled closer, feeling the strength of their protector and the king, their small bodies trembling but safe within the circle of trust. The shadow shrieked and writhed, unable to penetrate the bond formed by the Alpha, the Omega, and the pups. And in that moment, something shifted. The curse, long oppressive, long feeding on fear and isolation, met something it could not consume: unity, courage, and trust. The Omega fell to their knees, exhausted but resolute, clutching the smallest pup to their chest. The king knelt beside them, his hand resting on theirs. "It is ending," he said quietly. "We are stronger than its reach." For the first time, the shadow faltered, losing its shape and coherence. A final shriek echoed through the forest, a sound of fury and defeat, and then the darkness dispersed, melting into mist that vanished with the first light of dawn. The glade fell silent, but this time it was a calm, welcoming silence. Birds began to sing in the distance, and the wind carried warmth instead of chill. The pups stirred, eyes bright, sensing the end of the danger. They ran to the Omega, tails wagging, nuzzling and leaping in relief. The Omega exhaled, the tension leaving their body in waves. "It is done," they whispered, their voice trembling with relief. "The curse, it is broken." The king placed a steady hand on the Omega's shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath the surface. "No," he said softly. "You did this."
You carried the burden and you endured. I only walked with you.
But together, we faced it. The Omega looked at him then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, and a fragile promise of trust. They had been alone for so long, and yet now, in the shadow of victory, they allowed themselves to feel something new: connection. The pups circled them both, sensing the bond that had formed. They yipped softly, playful but relieved, breaking the tension that had held the night captive. For the first time in many moons, the forest felt safe. The king knelt beside the Omega, his gaze steady, his voice low and tender. "You need not carry your burden alone again." "Not now, not ever." The Omega's lips curved faintly. The first real smile since the journey began. I think I am ready to try," they said, voice soft but certain. "To trust. To The king extended his hand, not in command, but in partnership. "Then we walk forward together," he said. The Omega took it, a gesture simple yet profound. Their fingers entwined, a symbol of balance, of trust, and of shared strength. The pups danced around them, weaving between their legs as if celebrating the bond that had been forged in moonlight and shadow. As they moved toward the edge of the forest, the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, casting gold across the leaves and the faces of those who had endured. The curse, once oppressive and dark, now seemed distant, powerless. The forest itself seemed to acknowledge the transformation, the quiet harmony of hearts joined in courage, care, and understanding. The king and Omega walked side by side, the distance between them no longer measured by authority or fear, but by respect and connection.
The pups followed, leaping and bounding with joy, their laughter like barks echoing in the quiet morning.
This is only the beginning, the Omega said softly, glancing at the king.
Psst. There are more trials ahead. But now, we face them together. The king nodded.
Together, he repeated, his voice carrying a calm certainty. And we will endure.
Always. They emerged from the forest into a valley bathed in sunlight. The kingdom lay beyond, silent and waiting. The Alpha King gazed out at the horizon, thinking of the responsibility that awaited him, and of the bond that had transformed him. He had learned something vital. Power was not measured in conquest or fear, but in courage, compassion, and the willingness to walk alongside those who had suffered. The Omega moved beside him, head held high, yet shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. The weight they had carried alone was now shared, and in that sharing they had discovered something more powerful than any curse: trust, connection, and a quiet love that did not demand, but grew from respect and care. The pups tumbled around them, chasing each other through the grass, playful and free, their laughter a balm to the weary hearts of their protectors. The king and Omega watched, their hands still entwined, and for the first time the world seemed lighter, brighter, and full of possibility. A soft breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and pine, and the faintest whisper of the forest itself seemed to murmur approval. The curse had been broken, yes, but the true victory lay in the hearts of those who had endured it together. The Alpha King's gaze shifted to the Omega, and he saw not just resilience, but hope, not just strength, but warmth. "You have shown me what it means to protect and to care," he said quietly. "And I will walk with you always." "And I," they whispered, "will not face the world alone again. With you, perhaps."
The pups barked in excitement, running ahead as if sensing the dawn of a new era.
The king and Omega followed, their steps synchronized, hearts aligned, moving forward into a future built not on fear, but on trust, courage, and the quiet, enduring power of love. The forest behind them was still, peaceful, the shadows no longer threatening. The curse had been vanquished, but more importantly, the hearts of those who had endured its darkness had been healed. The Alpha King and the Omega had found balance, trust, and a bond forged through hardship and choice, stronger than any shadow could ever claim. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, casting golden light across the valley, the King and Omega paused. The pups gathered around them, tails wagging, eyes bright with hope. The journey was far from over, but the trials of the night had been faced, and a new chapter had begun. And in that quiet golden dawn, the Alpha King and the Omega shared a single understanding, a promise that neither time nor shadow could erase. They would face the world together, their hearts bound by courage, loyalty, and the enduring power of trust.